They say absolute power corrupts absolutely, but they never tell you what happens when the most terrifying man in Chicago loses the one thing that makes him feel like a man. Vincent Moretti ruled the city's criminal underworld with an iron, blood-soaked fist. He possessed the wealth of a small nation, the blind fear of the police force, and a devastating, humiliating secret. 3 years ago, a rival syndicate didn't just break his empire, they broke his body. He was an untouchable king, but behind closed doors he was utterly hollow, impotent, dead inside, until a shattered coffee pot in a smoky, run-down diner brought him back to life. Listen closely, because this isn't a fairy tale. It's a story of blood, betrayal, and a waitress who accidentally walked into a monster's cage and woke him up. The penthouse of the St. Regis Chicago smelled of expensive leather, Cuban cigars, and the faint metallic tang of fear. Vincent Moretti stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering grid of the city. Down there, he was a god. Men whispered his name in back alleys and corporate boardrooms alike. At 34, he was the head of the Moretti crime family, a syndicate that had its fingers in everything from the dock workers' unions to high-stakes real estate development along the Magnificent Mile. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal Brioni suit. He looked every inch the ruthless predator the world believed him to be, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the bottom of Lake Michigan in February. But the suit, the armored Maybach 62S waiting in the garage, the millions in offshore accounts, it was all a brilliantly crafted facade. Vincent was a hollow shell. The nightmare had happened exactly 3 years and 2 months ago. It was a cold Tuesday night in an abandoned meatpacking warehouse near the West Loop. The Calabrese faction, a rival group funded by European cartels, had set a trap. It wasn't just a hit, it was a message. They had strapped Vincent to a rusted steel chair and spent 6 agonizing hours dismantling him. They hadn't killed him. They wanted him to live as a broken king. The physical torture was brutal, but the psychological and neurological trauma was the true execution. When his underboss, Leo, finally breached the warehouse with a strike team, Vincent was drowning in his own blood. He survived. The physical wounds healed over months of agonizing rehabilitation. But when the bandages came off, Dr. Harrison Sterling, a discreet, top-tier private physician on the Moretti payroll, delivered the killing blow. The combination of severe nerve damage and profound psychological trauma had left Vincent entirely impotent. "It's a complete psychogenic and neurogenic block," Dr. Sterling had said, his voice trembling under Vincent's dead stare. "Your body survived, Mr. Moretti. But the trauma, your system has shut down the parasympathetic responses entirely. I'm sorry. You will likely never function as a man again." In the Mafia, perception is reality. A boss who cannot perform, who cannot produce an heir, is viewed as weak, a wounded animal. And in this jungle, wounded animals were eaten alive. So Vincent became crueler. He overcompensated with extreme violence and unyielding dominance. He ordered the execution of every single man involved in the Calabrese ambush, down to the mechanics who serviced their getaway cars. He built a wall of ice around himself. To keep up appearances, beautiful women, high-class escorts, aspiring actresses, socialites, were brought to his penthouse. They were paid exorbitant sums to sign NDAs, drink Dom Perignon, sleep in his guest room, and tell the world they had spent a passionate night with the Don. But inside, the frustration was a festering poison. He felt nothing. No desire, no spark, no warmth. Women touched him, and he felt nothing but the chilling reminder of his own inadequacy, The monster was dead below the waist, leaving only a calculating, merciless brain to run the city. Tonight was no different. Natalia, a stunning Russian model draped in silk, was waiting on his velvet sofa, nervously sipping champagne. "Vincent," she purred, her accent thick. "Are you coming to bed?" He didn't even turn around. "Take the envelope on the mahogany table. Tell your agency I was entirely satisfied. If you speak a word of what didn't happen here tonight, I will have you buried under the new casino foundation in Gary, Indiana. Leave." He heard her swallow hard, grab the envelope, and hurry out the door. When the click of the lock echoed in the massive penthouse, Vincent rested his forehead against the cold glass of the window. He was the most powerful man in the state, and he was completely, agonizingly powerless. 48 hours later, the rain was pouring in sheets across the south side of Chicago. Vincent needed to meet Jimmy, the Rat O'Connor, a corrupt union boss who had been skimming off the top of the shipping docks. To keep the FBI off their scent, they avoided the high-end steakhouses and met at O'Malley's, a gritty, late-night diner that smelled of stale grease, bleach, and burnt coffee. Vincent sat in a cracked red vinyl booth in the back corner. His massive bodyguard, Rocco, stood by the entrance, a menacing silhouette blocking the neon light of the diner's sign. Jimmy sat across from Vincent, sweating profusely, babbling excuses about missing container shipments. Vincent wasn't listening. He was detached, calculating exactly how many of Jimmy's fingers he would need to break to get the missing $2 million back. "I swear on my mother's grave, Mr. Moretti," Jimmy stammered, wiping his brow with a greasy napkin. "The feds were sniffing around the docks. I had to reroute the shipments to—" "Shut up," Vincent said softly. The sheer drop in his volume made the entire diner feel like a vacuum. Enter Leora Hayes. Leora was 24, exhausted, and running on exactly 3 hours of sleep. She was working her second double shift of the week. Her brown hair was escaping a messy bun, her cheap pink uniform was stained with ketchup, and her feet throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She didn't know who Vincent Moretti was. To her, he was just another arrogant guy in a ridiculously expensive suit taking up her section at 2 a.m. Carrying a heavy tray loaded with 3 plates of meatloaf and a fresh pot of scalding black coffee, Leora navigated the narrow aisle. Just as she approached the back booth, Jimmy, in a panic to explain himself, threw his arms wide. His heavy hand smacked directly into the bottom of Leora's tray. Physics took over. The tray tipped, the plates shattered on the checkered linoleum floor, and the glass pot of boiling coffee tipped forward, splashing directly onto the lapel and trousers of Vincent's $5,000 Brioni suit. Silence fell over the diner like a guillotine. Jimmy turned ghost white. Rocco's hand instantly dropped to the inside of his jacket, gripping the cold steel of his Beretta 92 FS. The cook in the back ducked behind the counter. Everyone who knew who Vincent was stopped breathing. Vincent slowly looked down at the dark, steaming stain spreading across his trousers. A dark, terrifying rage began to boil in his chest. He slowly raised his eyes to the waitress. He expected to see her crying, begging, cowering in terror like everyone else did. Instead, Leora slammed the empty tray onto the table with a loud crack. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped, her voice cracking with pure exhaustion and frustration. She didn't look at Jimmy. She looked right into Vincent's cold, dead eyes. "I have been on my feet for 16 hours. That coffee pot is older than I am, and now it's in 100 pieces because your friend here can't keep his hands to himself." Jimmy gasped. "You stupid girl, do you know who—" "I don't care if he's the mayor of Chicago," Leora shot back, grabbing a handful of rough paper napkins and tossing them onto the table. "You're paying for the broken plates, and I'm not cleaning this up until you learn some basic table manners." Rocco took a step forward, drawing his weapon halfway. "Boss, let me handle this." Vincent raised a single finger. Rocco froze. Vincent stared at the girl. Her chest was heaving with indignation. Her cheeks were flushed. Her hazel eyes were blazing with a defiant fire that cut through the sterile, terrifying bubble he lived in. She wasn't looking at the Mafia Don. She was looking at a nuisance. She smelled like cheap vanilla body wash, sweat and rain. And then, something impossible happened. As Vincent stared at her flashing eyes and felt her absolute, reckless lack of fear, a shockwave tore through his system. It started at the base of his spine, a hot, electric jolt that bypassed his broken mind and hit his deadened nerves. His breath hitched. His pulse, which always beat at a slow, calculated rhythm, suddenly spiked. Blood rushed south. Beneath the table, hidden by the steaming coffee stains, Vincent Moretti felt a physical reaction. Hard, sudden, and undeniable. For the first time in over 3 years, he was awake. The monster wasn't dead. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to wake it up. The shock of it left him completely speechless. He just stared at her. Leora shifted uncomfortably under his intense, burning gaze. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a sudden, chilling realization of the danger in the air. The man's eyes had gone completely black. Leora stammered, stepping back. "I'll get a mop." She turned and fled to the kitchen. Jimmy was practically sobbing. "Mr. Moretti, please, she's a nobody. I'll have the owner fire her right now. "Jimmy," Vincent interrupted. His voice was different, thicker, deeper. "Leave the money you owe me in the trunk of the car outside by noon tomorrow. If it's a penny short, I'll feed your family to the feral dogs in the rail yards." Vincent stood up. The physical proof of his miraculous recovery was painfully, gloriously evident against his soaked trousers. He dropped a $100 bill on the table. He looked at the kitchen door where the waitress had disappeared. Leora, her cheap plastic name tag, had read. "Rocco," Vincent commanded as he walked toward the exit, the rain howling outside. "Yes, boss. I want everything on that waitress. Where she lives, where she sleeps, who she owes. I want a full dossier by sunrise." For the next 4 days, Vincent Moretti didn't sleep. He operated in a state of hyper-focused adrenaline. The hollow void in his chest had been violently replaced by an all-consuming, terrifying obsession. He had tested himself, of course. Back in the safety of his penthouse, he had tried to summon the reaction again. He looked at photos of stunning women, watched videos, remembered past lovers. Nothing. The cold, dead numbness returned, but the second he closed his eyes and remembered the hazel-eyed girl in the pink uniform, the smell of vanilla and grease, the fiery defiance in her voice, his body responded with a vicious, aching intensity. She was the key. She was the only thing in the world that could make him a man again. And in Vincent's dark, twisted world, what he needed, he owned. Rocco delivered the dossier within 12 hours. It sat on Vincent's heavy oak desk, a neat manila folder, detailing every tragic, mundane aspect of Leora Hayes's life. She lived in a dilapidated walk-up apartment on 42nd Street. She had dropped out of community college 2 years ago, when her mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She was drowning in medical debt, working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. But that wasn't the detail that made Vincent's lip curl into a predatory smile. Leora had a younger brother, Tommy Hayes, a 21-year-old junkie and wannabe tough guy who had recently made a catastrophic mistake. Tommy had borrowed $50,000 from Frankie Bones, a vicious loan shark who operated out of an underground casino in the South Side. and Frankie Bones kicked up his earnings to the Calabrese family, the exact same syndicate that had tortured and broken Vincent 3 years ago. Leora was trapped in a web spun by Vincent's mortal enemies. It was poetic. It was perfect. Vincent began to shadow her. He didn't approach her immediately. He became a ghost, haunting the edges of her life. He sat in his tinted Maybach across the street from her apartment building, watching her trudge home in the rain, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He watched her buy cheap groceries at the corner bodega. He watched the light in her bedroom flick off at 3 a.m. Every time he saw her, the dark hunger inside him grew, an intoxicating mix of lust and an overwhelming, violent possessiveness. He was going to take her, but he wasn't going to force her. He was a tactician. He was going to make her beg him to stay. The opportunity arrived on a Thursday night. Leora was finishing her late shift at O'Malley's. The diner was empty, save for the cook in the back. She tied off the garbage bag, hoisted it over her shoulder, and pushed open the heavy metal back door, stepping out into the dark, rain-slicked alleyway. She froze. 3 men were waiting by the dumpsters. They wore cheap leather jackets and ugly, cruel smiles. Leora immediately recognized the leader, a scarred, heavy-set man named Sal, one of Frankie Bones's enforcers. "Evening, Leora," Sal sneered, tossing a half-smoked cigarette into a puddle. "Your piece of shit brother is dodging our calls. Frankie's losing his patience." Leora's heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped the garbage bag. "I told you, I don't know where Tommy is. He hasn't been home in a week. You have to leave me alone." "Can't do that, sweetheart," Sal said, pulling a long, serrated hunting knife from his belt. The 2 men behind him stepped forward, boxing her in. "The debt is 50 grand, plus interest. Tommy ain't paying, which means the debt falls on the next of kin. Now you can't pay us in cash." Sal's eyes raked up and down her body in the wet uniform. "But Frankie runs a couple of private clubs downtown. We put you on a stage, maybe in a private room. You'll work off that 50 grand in a few years." "No!" Leora gasped, backing up against the brick wall of the diner. Her hand scrambled blindly for the door handle, but one of the goons lunged, grabbing her wrist and slamming her hard against the wet bricks. "Scream and I'll cut your pretty face before we put you to work," Sal whispered, bringing the cold steel of the knife to her cheek. Leora closed her eyes, a tear mixing with the rain on her face. She braced for the nightmare. Crack! The sound of a silenced gunshot echoed in the narrow alley. It was sharp, like a whip cracking. The man holding Leora's wrist stiffened. A neat, black hole appeared in the center of his forehead. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, splashing heavily into the dirty puddle at Leora's feet. Sal yelled, spinning around with his knife. From the deep shadows at the end of the alley, a figure emerged. The rain seemed to part around him. Vincent Moretti walked forward with the slow, terrifying grace of an apex predator. He wore a black trench coat over a bespoke suit, a suppressed Heckler and Koch USP tactical pistol resting casually in his right hand. "You're making a mess in my city." Vincent's voice rolled through the alley, smooth, deep, and deadly cold. Sal recognized him instantly. The knife dropped from his trembling hand. Mr. Moretti, we didn't know this was your territory. We're with Frankie Bones. Calabrese business." "I know," Vincent said softly. He raised the weapon and fired twice. Sal and the remaining goon dropped dead to the asphalt, blood pooling rapidly in the rain. Leora slid down the brick wall, hitting the ground, her chest heaving in absolute terror. She stared at the 3 dead bodies, then up at the man standing over them. She recognized the cold, dark eyes from the diner a few nights ago. The man whose suit she had ruined. Vincent holstered his weapon and slowly walked over to her. He crouched down, ignoring the blood and rain soaking the knees of his expensive trousers. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently gripping her chin, forcing her to look into his eyes. Her skin was freezing, trembling under his touch. And just like before, the contact sent a roaring fire through his veins. He was completely, powerfully alive. "They were going to sell you to the Calabrese family," Vincent said softly, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "Your brother's debt is paid. I bought it this morning." Leora stared at him, her lips parting in shock. You bought it?" "Yes." Vincent leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, possessive whisper. "You don't owe Frankie Bones anymore, Leora. You owe me." The heavy, bulletproof door of the Maybach closed with a solid, suffocating thud, cutting off the sound of the howling Chicago rain. Leora sat rigidly against the plush, cream-colored leather, her breathing shallow and frantic. She was soaking wet, shivering violently, her hands clamped together in her lap. Next to her sat Vincent Moretti, radiating a terrifying, quiet heat. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead as the luxury vehicle pulled smoothly out of the alley, leaving the blood and the bodies behind. "I didn't ask you to do that," Leora whispered, her voice trembling so hard it barely carried over the hum of the engine. "I didn't ask you to shoot them, or pay my brother's debt." Vincent slowly turned his head. In the dim, amber glow of the streetlights flashing through the tinted windows, his face looked carved from marble. "If I hadn't stepped into that alley, Leora, you would be chained to a radiator in a basement in Cicero by tomorrow morning. Your brother would be missing his fingers, and your mother would be evicted from her hospital bed. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you had another way out." The brutal honesty of his words hit her like a physical blow. She swallowed hard, tears of pure, helpless frustration pricking her eyes. "Why? Why me? I spilled coffee on you. I insulted you. Men like you don't drop $50,000 on a waitress who ruins their suits." "Men like me," Vincent echoed softly, a dark, humorless smile touching his lips. "You have absolutely no idea what kind of man I am. But you will learn." He reached across the wide console. Leora flinched, pressing herself against the door, but he merely picked up a heavy cashmere blanket from the seat and draped it over her shivering shoulders. His knuckles briefly brushed against her damp neck. The contact was agonizingly brief, but Leora felt a jolt of electricity snap between them. She gasped, looking up into his eyes. They were completely dilated, pitch black, and burning with a hunger she couldn't begin to comprehend. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Home," Vincent replied, turning his gaze back to the window. "You don't live in that rotting walk-up anymore. The debt you owed Frankie Bones now belongs to the Moretti family. $50,000. At a generous interest rate, it will take you approximately 5 years to work it off." "Work it off doing what?" Panic clawed at her throat. Sal's threat about dancing in private clubs echoed in her mind. I'm not a—" "You are going to be my personal aide," Vincent interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will manage my schedule within my residence. You will be available to me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You will sleep where I tell you to sleep, eat what I provide, and you will not leave my properties without my explicit permission and a security detail." "That's not a job," Leora shot back, a flicker of her diner defiance breaking through the terror. "That's a hostage situation. That's a cage." Vincent leaned closer, the scent of expensive cologne and gun smoke washing over her. "It is a cage constructed of solid gold, Leora. Your mother's medical bills will be paid in full tomorrow morning. Your brother will be given a one-way ticket to a rehabilitation center in Arizona, and if he leaves it, my men will break his legs. Your family is safe. but in exchange, you belong to me. The Maybach descended into a private subterranean parking garage beneath the St. Regis. Leora felt the trap snapping shut around her. She was a fiercely independent woman who had fought tooth and nail just to survive, and in the span of an hour, a monster had bought her entire existence. Vincent's penthouse was a sprawling, silent fortress in the sky. It was immaculate, cold, and breathtakingly expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm raging over Lake Michigan. Rocco, the massive bodyguard, silently took Vincent's wet trench coat, his eyes never lingering on Leora for more than a second. "Show Miss Hayes to the East Wing guest suite," Vincent commanded Rocco, stripping off his suit jacket. He finally looked back at Leora, his gaze dropping to her stained, wet uniform. "Tomorrow, a stylist will arrive to dispose of your current wardrobe. Sleep well, Leora. Your debt collection begins at sunrise." For the first time in his life, as Vincent watched her walk down the long, shadowed hallway, he didn't care about the $2 million missing from the docks. He didn't care about the Calabresi family. He walked into his master bathroom, turned on the scalding shower, and braced his hands against the marble wall. He closed his eyes and remembered the brief, accidental brush of his knuckles against her neck in the car. Instantly, his body roared to life. The physical reaction was violent, aching, and absolute. He gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping his throat. He wasn't just awake, he was starved. And the only feast in the world was sleeping just 3 doors down. A week passed in a blur of surreal, suffocating luxury. Leora's life had been completely overwritten. The cheap pink diner uniform was gone, replaced by a wardrobe of silk blouses, tailored slacks, and cashmere sweaters that cost more than her community college tuition. Her mother was suddenly receiving experimental, top-tier treatments at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, entirely funded by an anonymous benefactor. Tommy was gone, shipped off to the desert with a terrifying warning ringing in his ears. She was safe. But she was losing her mind. Vincent Moretti was a phantom who demanded her constant proximity. He didn't touch her, didn't make inappropriate comments, and didn't lock her in a room. It was far more psychological. He required her to pour his black coffee in the morning. He made her sit in the corner of his massive home office while he conducted encrypted phone calls, murmuring in rapid-fire Italian about shipping routes, political bribes, and weapons shipments. She was learning exactly who he was. He was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld. And yet, amidst the blood and the billions, his entire focus always seemed to drift back to her. She could feel his eyes on her skin. It was a heavy, physical weight. When she moved, he watched. When she breathed, he listened. On a Tuesday evening, the tension in the penthouse reached a boiling point. Vincent's underboss, Leo, was pacing the length of the office. Leo was a sharp, vicious man with slicked-back hair and a permanent scowl. Leora sat frozen on a velvet armchair in the corner, trying to make herself invisible while holding a tablet with Vincent's schedule. They found Sal and the other two in the alley. "Boss!" Leo growled, slamming a fist onto Vincent's mahogany desk. "Frankie Bones is losing his mind. He went crying to the Calabresi bosses. They know it was our ammunition. They're demanding a sit-down, Vincent. They want blood for blood." Vincent sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers. He looked terrifyingly calm. "Let them demand." Frankie Bones overstepped his boundaries. He was operating an unsanctioned loan sharking ring in my territory. "It wasn't about the territory, and you know it!" Leo snapped, gesturing wildly. He pointed a sharp finger directly at Leora. "It was about her. You clipped 3 made men over a waitress, Vincent. The capos are whispering. They think you're losing your edge. They think you're thinking with your—" "Leo." Vincent didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice, but the sheer, localized drop in temperature in the room was enough to freeze Leo mid-sentence. Vincent stood up slowly. The lethal grace of his movements made Leora's heart hammer against her ribs. "You will never," Vincent said, his voice a silken thread of pure malice, "question my motives in my own home, and you will never point your finger at what belongs to me. Am I understood?" Leo swallowed hard, all the bluster draining from his face. "Yes, Don Moretti. My apologies." "Set the sit-down with the Calabrese family for Friday night at the abandoned rail yards," Vincent commanded, his eyes completely dead. "Tell them to bring Frankie Bones. We will settle this." "Yes, boss." Leo practically fled the room, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Leora stared at her lap, her hands shaking. She was the reason a Mafia war was about to erupt. She was the catalyst for the bodies in the alley. "Bring me a bourbon, Leora," Vincent murmured, sinking back into his leather chair, rubbing his temples. She set the tablet down and walked over to the crystal decanter on the side table. Her hands were trembling so badly that the heavy glass stopper clinked loudly against the rim. She poured 2 fingers of amber liquid and slowly approached his desk. "I'm sorry," she whispered, extending the glass toward him. "I didn't mean to cause all of this. If you just let me go." "Stop," Vincent commanded. He didn't take the glass. Instead, his large, warm hand wrapped entirely around her trembling wrist. The shock of his touch made Leora gasp, a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. He pulled her forward, around the side of the massive desk, until she was standing between his knees. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at him, trapped in his gravity. The cold, calculating mob boss was gone. In his eyes, she saw a desperate, agonizing fire. "You think I care about Frankie Bones?" Vincent whispered, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse jumping at her wrist. "You think I care about a war with the Calabrese family? I would burn this entire city to the foundation before I let them put their hands on you again." "Why?" Leora breathed, unable to look away, terrified by the sheer intensity of his obsession. "Vincent, please, you don't even know me." "I know that before you walked into that diner, I was dead," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, becoming rough and fractured. He released her wrist and slowly slid his hands up her waist, his long fingers gripping her hips through the thin silk of her blouse. "And now, look at what you do to me, Leora. Look at what you made me." He pulled her flush against his body. Leora's eyes widened in pure shock as the physical reality of his arousal pressed hard against her stomach. It was undeniable, dominant, demanding. She froze, a terrifying mix of fear, confusion, and a sudden, dark thrill rushing through her veins. Vincent didn't give her time to process it. The iron control he had maintained for a week finally shattered. He pulled her down, his hand tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck, and crushed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claiming. It was a starving man finally tasting food. His lips were punishing and hot, his tongue forcing her lips apart, tasting the vanilla and fear on her breath. Leora whimpered, her hands instinctively coming up to push against his broad chest. But the solid wall of muscle beneath his suit didn't yield an inch. The kiss deepened, turning frantic. Vincent groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure salvation, pulling her so tightly against him she could feel the furious pounding of his heart. The sensory overload was intoxicating. He was danger. He was death. But in this moment, he was pouring every ounce of his broken, resurrected soul into her. Leora's hands, which had been pushing him away, slowly, traitorously curled into the lapels of his suit. When Vincent finally broke the kiss, they were both gasping for air. He rested his forehead against hers, his chest heaving, his hands gripping her waist like a vice. "You're not leaving, Leora?" Vincent whispered against her lips, his breath hot and ragged. "You are my cure, and I am never letting you go." Before Leora could find the breath to reply, the heavy oak doors of the office burst open. Rocco stood in the doorway, his weapon drawn, his face pale. "Boss!" Rocco barked, his eyes darting to Leora before snapping back to Vincent. "Perimeter alarm just tripped. Security feed shows a breach in the lower garage. It's not the Calabrese crew." Vincent's demeanor shifted in a microsecond. The desperate lover vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless king. He pushed Leora behind him, drawing his own weapon from his shoulder holster in one fluid motion. "Who is it?" Vincent demanded. Rocco swallowed hard. "It's the kid, boss. It's Tommy Hayes. He's back from Arizona, and he's wearing a wire." The transition was instantaneous and terrifying. 1 second, Vincent Moretti was a man consumed by a desperate, agonizing passion, his heart hammering against Leora's chest. The next, he was the apex predator of Chicago, a man carved from ice and violence. The warmth vanished from his eyes, leaving behind a dead black void. He didn't let go of Leora entirely. His left hand gripped her bicep, hauling her behind him as he strode out of the office. Rocco flanked them, his weapon scanning the shadows of the penthouse hallway. "Elevator!" Vincent snapped. "Override the security protocols. Take us straight to the sub-basement." "Vincent, wait!" Leora stumbled, her high heels catching on the plush carpet. "Tommy? Why is he here? You sent him to Arizona." "Your brother is a junkie and a coward, Leora," Vincent said, his voice devoid of any emotion as the heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid shut. "And cowards are easily bought. The question is who bought him." The descent to the subterranean garage took exactly 40 seconds. To Leora, it felt like a descent into hell. The doors parted to reveal the cavernous, concrete expanse of the St. Regis private parking level. The smell of high-octane fuel and damp concrete filled the air. Near the exit ramp, pinned face down against the hood of a black SUV by 2 of Vincent's heavily armed enforcers, was Tommy. He was thrashing, screaming obscenities, his face scraped and bleeding from the concrete. "Leora, Leora, help me!" Tommy shrieked, spotting her legs behind Vincent's imposing frame. "They're gonna kill me! Tell them to let me go!" Leora's heart shattered. She tried to step forward, the instinct to protect her little brother overriding her fear. But Vincent's arm shot out, a rigid iron bar across her chest, pinning her in place. "Do not move," Vincent commanded softly. He walked slowly toward the SUV. The enforcers stepped back slightly, allowing Vincent to loom over the trembling boy. "I gave you a first-class ticket to a luxury rehabilitation clinic, Thomas," Vincent murmured, pulling a pair of black leather gloves from his coat pocket and slowly pulling them on. "I cleared your $50,000 debt. I ensured your mother's hospital bills were paid. And yet, here you are, trespassing on my property." "I didn't want to come," Tommy sobbed, spitting blood onto the pristine hood of the car. "They made me. Detective Gallagher, from the 12th District. He picked me up at O'Hare before I even got on the plane. He said if I didn't come here and get you on tape, they'd pin the alley murders on me." "I had to do it, man," Leora gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. "He was wearing a wire for the police." Vincent didn't blink. He reached down, grabbed the collar of Tommy's cheap jacket, and hauled him upright. With a sickeningly loud rip, Vincent tore the boy's shirt open down the middle. There, taped to Tommy's sunken, sweating chest, was a flat black transmitter and a tiny microphone. "Detective Gallagher," Vincent said, his voice projecting clearly into the microphone. A corrupt vice cop who has been on the Calabrese payroll for 3 years. You didn't come here for the police, Thomas. You came here because the Calabrese family used a dirty badge to turn you into a rat. I didn't know, Tommy wailed. I just wanted to save myself. Leora, tell him. You owe me, Leora. I'm your blood. Owe you? Leora's voice shook. She stepped out from behind the pillar, her hazel eyes blazing with a mixture of profound grief and sudden, white-hot fury. You borrowed money from the mob to buy drugs. You left me to be sold to a private club to pay your debts. And now you brought a wire into the home of the man who saved my life? To save yourself? Tommy stared at her, stunned by the absolute venom in his sister's voice. Vincent looked at Leora, and for a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitched upward in a dark, approving smile. She was adapting. The cage was changing her. Vincent turned his attention back to the microphone taped to Tommy's chest. He leaned in close. Gallagher, Vincent whispered into the wire, his voice a silken threat that would freeze the blood of whoever was listening on the other end. I know you're in a van parked on Lower Wacker right now. Listen to me very carefully. By tomorrow morning, your pension will be gone. Your offshore accounts in the Caymans will be emptied, and the Internal Affairs Division will receive a very detailed ledger of your transactions with Don Dominic Calabrese. Run. Vincent reached out and violently ripped the wire from Tommy's chest, taking a patch of skin and hair with it. Tommy screamed. Vincent dropped the transmitter onto the concrete and crushed it beneath the heel of his Italian leather shoe. "Throw him in the trunk," Vincent ordered his men, turning his back on the crying boy. "No!" Leora lunged forward, grabbing Vincent's arm. "Vincent, please, don't kill him. He's an idiot. He's broken. But please!" Vincent stopped. He looked down at her small, pale hand, clutching the dark fabric of his sleeve. The physical contact sent that familiar, agonizing jolt of electricity straight to his groin. He fought to keep his face entirely neutral. "I am not going to kill him, Leora," Vincent said softly, raising his gloved hand to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I am going to put him on a private jet. I am sending him to a facility in Zurich. It is essentially a prison for the wealthy and addicted. He will stay there for 5 years. He will get clean. But he will never step foot in Chicago or near you, ever again." Leora looked at Tommy, who was currently weeping as Rocco dragged him toward a waiting sedan. She looked back at Vincent, the ruthless, terrifying Mafia boss who had just shown more loyalty and protection in 1 hour than her brother had in a lifetime. "Thank you," she whispered, the fight completely draining out of her. Vincent's eyes darkened. "Do not thank me yet, mia cara. The Calabrese family just forced my hand. We have a sit-down on Friday, and you are coming with me." Friday night arrived with a suffocating, humid heat that clung to the city like a wet blanket. The abandoned rail yards on the industrial edge of the South Side were a graveyard of rusted boxcars, shattered glass, and overgrown weeds. It was neutral territory, a place where blood had been spilled for decades. Leora sat in the back of the armored Maybach, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but she was also painfully aware of how she looked. A private stylist had arrived at the penthouse that afternoon, dressing her in a sleek, midnight blue Givenchy sheath dress that hugged her curves flawlessly. A delicate diamond choker rested at her throat, a gift from Vincent, heavy and cold. She looked like a Mafia queen. She felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter. Vincent sat beside her, radiating a lethal, coiled energy. He wore a pitch-black suit, a black shirt, and no tie. He looked every inch the Grim Reaper. "Stay behind me," Vincent murmured as the car rolled to a stop, the headlights cutting through the dark, to illuminate a circle of 4 luxury SUVs parked between the rusted trains. Do not speak unless spoken to, and do not look away, Leora. I want you to see exactly how I keep you safe. The doors opened. The humid air smelled of ozone, rust, and cheap cigars. A dozen heavily armed men stood in a loose circle. In the center, standing beneath the flickering yellow light of a solitary street lamp, was Don Dominic Calabrese. He was a man in his late 60s, built like a brick wall, with a face heavily scarred by a lifetime of violence. Beside him stood Frankie Bones, sweating profusely, looking like a rat caught in a trap. As Vincent approached, flanked by Leo, Rocco, and Leora, the tension in the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. The Calabrese soldiers openly stared at Leora, their eyes filled with dirty curiosity. Vincent noticed. He shifted his broad shoulders, completely blocking their line of sight, a possessive growl vibrating low in his chest. "Moretti," Don Calabrese rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "You have a lot of nerve bringing a woman to a sit-down, especially the little waitress who started this mess." "She didn't start anything, Dominic," Vincent replied smoothly, stopping 10 feet from the older boss. "Frankie Bones started it when he decided to run an unsanctioned loan sharking operation in my territory. He targeted citizens under my protection. She owes me 50 grand, Frankie Bones spat, stepping forward, pointing a shaking finger at Leora. "And you clipped 3 of my best earners in an alley over a diner girl. I clipped 3 rabid dogs making a mess on my streets," Vincent countered, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "And then, Frankie, you decided to compound your stupidity by paying Detective Gallagher to wire her brother and send him into my home." Don Calabrese slowly turned his heavy head to look at Frankie. "Is this true? You used a badge to breach a Moretti property without my authorization?" Frankie turned ghost white. "Don Dominic, I was trying to get leverage. He killed Sal. We needed intel to strike back." Vincent didn't wait for the old man to respond. He took a calculated step forward. "You are losing control of your dogs, Dominic. They operate in my territory. They bring the FBI to my doorstep, and they threaten what belongs to me." "So what is the price for peace, Vincent?" Calabrese asked, his eyes narrowing. He was old school. He knew a bad hand when he saw one, and Frankie had severely overplayed his. "There is no price," Vincent said. "There is only a penalty." Before anyone could blink, before the Calabrese guards could even twitch toward their holsters, Vincent moved. It was a blur of calculated, terrifying violence. He drew the suppressed H&K from his shoulder holster and fired a single, deafening shot. Crack! Frankie Bones's head snapped back. A spray of crimson painted the rusted side of the boxcar behind him. He crumpled to the gravel, dead before his knees hit the dirt. Guns were drawn instantly. A dozen lasers danced across Vincent's chest. Rocco and Leo had their weapons aimed squarely at Don Calabrese's head. Leora screamed, covering her ears, dropping to her knees in the dirt. "Hold your fire!" Don Calabrese roared, raising his hands. He looked down at Frankie's bleeding corpse, then back up at Vincent. The old Don was furious, but he wasn't suicidal. He recognized absolute dominance. "He broke the rules of the commission," Vincent stated, slowly lowering his weapon, his black eyes locked on Calabrese. "He brought the police into our affairs. I just cleaned up your mess, Dominic. The debt is settled. The territory lines remain. If you want a war over a dead loan shark, draw your weapon right now." Silence stretched over the rail yard, broken only by the sound of Frankie's blood dripping onto the gravel. Calabrese stared at Vincent for a long, agonizing minute. He saw the cold, hollow emptiness in the younger boss's eyes, the look of a man who literally had nothing to lose and was perfectly willing to die in this dirt. "The debt is settled," Calabrese finally grunted, spitting on the ground. He gestured to his men. "Load the meat into the trunk. We're done here." As the Calabrese SUVs peeled out of the rail yard, kicking up dust and gravel, Vincent holstered his weapon. He didn't look at the blood. He turned, the coldness in his eyes instantly melting as he looked down at Leora kneeling in the dirt. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the ruin of his expensive suit trousers. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs wiping the dust from her cheeks. She was trembling violently, her eyes wide, staring at the pool of blood just 10 feet away. "Look at me," Vincent commanded softly. "Leora, look at me." She forced her eyes to meet his. "I told you," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying devotion. "I will burn the city to the ground before I let anyone touch you. You are safe." The adrenaline, the terror, the overwhelming realization that this monster had just executed a man to protect her. It broke something deep inside Leora. The barrier of her old life shattered completely. She didn't pull away from his blood-stained hands. Instead, leaning into the madness, she let out a broken sob and pressed her face against his chest, her fingers clutching his lapels. Vincent crushed her against him, burying his face in her hair. As he held her in the darkness of the rail yard, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and death, a massive, undeniable surge of heat rushed through his veins. The physical reaction was so intense, so violent, he had to grit his teeth to keep from groaning out loud. The monster wasn't just awake anymore, he was starving. And tonight, he was going to feed. The ride back to the St. Regis was a blur of deafening silence and blinding city lights cutting through the rain-slicked windows of the Maybach. Leora sat pressed against Vincent's side, her fingers still twisted tightly into the ruined, blood-spattered fabric of his suit jacket. She was shivering, but no longer from fear. It was the aftershock of survival, the chaotic adrenaline of watching a man die to ensure she kept breathing. Vincent's arm was an iron band around her waist. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered beneath his ear. The control he was exerting over his own body was monumental. The cold, dead numbness that had defined his existence for over 3 years was gone, vaporized in the violent crucible of the rail yard. In its place was a roaring, agonizing inferno. He could feel every shift of her body, every ragged breath she took, every terrified beat of her heart against his ribs. When the private elevator doors opened into the penthouse, Vincent didn't issue orders to Rocco or Leo. He simply walked Leora down the long, shadowed hallway, his grip unyielding, until they reached the massive master suite. He kicked the heavy mahogany door shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. He let go of her, but only to strip off his shoulder holster, the heavy Heckler & Koch hitting the floor with a metallic thud. He tore off his blood-stained jacket and threw it into the corner. Leora stood frozen by the edge of the king-sized bed, her midnight blue Givenchy dress immaculate, save for a smudge of dirt on the hem. She looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer, predatory intensity radiating from him. "Vincent," she whispered, her voice cracking. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't stop until there was no space left between them. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the delicate skin above her collarbone. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a dark, jagged rasp that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "Are you afraid of me, Leora?" After what you just saw, she looked up into his pitch-black eyes. She thought about Frankie Bones bleeding out on the gravel. She thought about the terrifying, ruthless power this man wielded. But then she thought about the absolute, uncompromising way he had shielded her body with his own, the way he had bought her brother's life and her mother's health. "No," she breathed, the absolute truth of it shocking her. "I'm not afraid of you." A low, guttural groan tore from Vincent's throat. The last thread of his legendary restraint snapped. He crushed his mouth to hers, backing her up until her calves hit the edge of the mattress. There was no gentleness left in him, only a starving, desperate need. He devoured her, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, tasting her breath, claiming her entirely. Leora gasped against his lips, her hands instinctively flying up to grip his broad, muscular shoulders. The sheer heat coming off his body was intoxicating. As he pressed her backward onto the mattress, following her down, the physical reality of his recovery was impossible to ignore. The psychogenic block that had rendered the most powerful man in Chicago a hollow shell was completely, irrevocably shattered. Vincent broke the kiss, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of vanilla that had haunted him since that night in O'Malley's diner. 3 years, he whispered against her skin, his hands trailing down her sides, gripping the curve of her hips. I was a ghost. I felt nothing. Women, money, power. It was all ash in my mouth. Until a waitress with flashing eyes broke my mind and dragged me back from the dead. Leora looked up at the ceiling, her chest heaving, the reality of her power washing over her. She wasn't just a captive in a golden cage. She held the key to the monster's chains. She reached up, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair, pulling him back up to meet her gaze. "Then show me," Leora challenged, her voice trembling but laced with a sudden, dark defiance. "Show me you're alive." The darkness in Vincent's eyes flared into a consuming fire. He stripped away the remnants of his suit and the expensive silk of her dress, tossing them onto the floor. When skin finally met skin, it was a collision of two desperate souls. Every touch was an electrical charge, every kiss a violent reclamation of his manhood. For the first time in his life, Vincent Moretti didn't take power. He surrendered it. He worshipped her. He memorized every curve, every gasp, every arch of her back, driving them both into a blinding, breathless frenzy. In the safety of the fortress in the sky, high above the sirens and the blood of Chicago, the king was finally reborn, and the waitress who had spilled coffee on his custom suit became his absolute, undeniable obsession. 6 months later, the private dining room at Alinea, Chicago's most exclusive 3 Michelin-star restaurant, was closed to the public. Outside, a small army of Moretti enforcers secured the perimeter, their tailored suits hiding heavy weaponry. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, smelling of white truffles, expensive wine, and imminent violence. Vincent Moretti sat at the head of the long oak table, nursing a glass of 20-year-old Pappy Van Winkle. He looked like a god of war at rest, calm, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, a heavy gold Rolex Daytona catching the dim light on his wrist. But the true shift in power sat immediately to his right. Leora Moretti was unrecognizable from the exhausted girl in the pink uniform. She wore a backless, emerald-green silk gown, her hair swept up in an elegant twist. The delicate diamond choker at her throat had been replaced by a heavy, brilliant-cut diamond necklace that cost more than most residential blocks in the South Side. But the real transformation was in her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intelligence that mirrored the man sitting beside her. Across the table sat a sweating, pale man. It was Detective Gallagher. The corrupt vice cop who had strapped a wire to Tommy's chest half a year ago had tried to run. He had made it as far as Costa Rica before Vincent's men tracked him down, dragged him onto a private Gulfstream jet, and brought him back to the freezing Chicago winter. "Vincent, please," Gallagher choked out, his hands trembling as he stared at his untouched plate. "I swear to God, I was just following Calabrese orders. I have a family. I have kids." Vincent didn't say a word. He didn't even look at the man. He simply took a slow sip of his bourbon. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. Finally, Leora set her crystal wine glass down. The sharp clink made Gallagher flinch violently. "You have a family, detective?" Leora asked, her voice smooth, cultured, and laced with absolute poison. "How interesting. Because 6 months ago, you took my younger brother, a terrified addict who needed help, and you strapped a wire to his chest. You sent him into this man's home, knowing full well he would likely be killed." Gallagher swallowed hard, looking at Leora in disbelief. He remembered the dossier on her. She was a nobody, a diner waitress. Now she was looking at him with the exact same dead eyes as the Don himself. "Mrs. Moretti, Gallagher stammered. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," Leora said, leaning forward slightly, the diamonds catching the light, "was to uphold the law. Instead, you sold your badge to Frankie Bones. You put my family in the crosshairs to line your own pockets." Leora reached over and rested her hand over Vincent's on the table. The subtle, intimate gesture was a display of absolute, unbreakable unity. Vincent turned his hand over, his long fingers interlacing with hers, his thumb tracing her diamond wedding band. A dark, terrifyingly proud smile touched the corners of his mouth as he watched his wife work. "My husband," Leora continued softly, her gaze locked on the trembling cop, "wanted to have you dropped into the foundation of the new casino development in Gary. I asked him to bring you here instead." Gallagher's eyes widened with a desperate spark of hope. Thank you, Mrs. Moretti. I swear I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." "Oh, I know we won't," Leora smiled, a chilling, hollow expression. "Because I don't believe in loose ends, and I don't forgive men who put targets on my husband's back." Leora didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at the guards. She simply gave a minute, nearly imperceptible nod to Leo, who was standing by the mahogany doors. Leo stepped forward, drawing a suppressed pistol. "Wait, no!" Gallagher screamed, pushing his chair back. "You said, poof." The sound was muffled. Gallagher slumped forward, his face landing squarely in his plate of braised Wagyu beef, dead instantly. Leora didn't flinch. She picked up her linen napkin, delicately dabbed the corner of her mouth, and took a slow sip of her Cabernet. Vincent stared at her, the dark fire in his chest burning hotter than the day he met her. The transformation was complete. The world thought Vincent Moretti had kidnapped an innocent girl and dragged her into the darkness. They were wrong. He had simply given her the crown she was always meant to wear. She had stepped into the cage and realized she held the keys. He leaned over, brushing his lips against her ear, the scent of gunpowder and vanilla filling his senses. "You are magnificent, Mare Regina." Leora turned her head, meeting his gaze. The monster was awake, but he was hers. He was her sword, her shield, and her darkest devotion. "Clean up the mess, Leo," Leora ordered without looking away from her husband's burning eyes. "Vincent and I are going home." The diner girl was dead. The Queen of Chicago had arrived. From a shattered coffee pot in a smoky diner to the throne of Chicago's most dangerous criminal empire, Leora's journey proves that the line between a captive and a queen is just a matter of perspective. Vincent Moretti lost his manhood to violence, but he found his salvation and a ruthless partner in the one woman brave enough to look the devil in the eye and refuse to blink. The Calabrese family learned the hard way. You never back a monster into a corner, especially when he's fighting for the only thing that makes him human. If you loved this deep dive into the dark, twisted, and dangerously romantic world of the Moretti family, hit that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who loves a true dark romance where the villain gets the girl and makes her a villain, too. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next thrilling audio drama.